Sebastian Vettel, you are the world champion! The world champion, well done, enjoy it! You are the man!
Yes! Happy we did it! Happy we did it!
Woohoo! World champion! Oh my god! I can't believe it! Thank you so much, guys!
Heading into the decade, Formula One was hot, and I mean hot off an incredible streak of new world champions. Fernando Alonso in the end of 2005 and 6, then Kimi Raikkonen, Lewis Hamilton, who was only in his second year of Formula One, and of course, who could forget 2009, that incredible season, Brawn GP and Jenson Button picking up their first world title. Fast forward to 2019, 10 years on from that incredible season, and I think it's fair to say the 2010s didn't quite live up to the noughties. 3 world champions, Lewis Hamilton picking up 5 of the total 10 championships available, Sebastian Vettel picking up 4 of the 10 championships available, and the one other outlier, Nico Rosberg, sprinkled in 2016. But although on paper, on the surface, it doesn't look fantastic, you delve a little bit deeper. And actually, I think this decade has had some incredible races, some incredible seasons. And today, I really want to explore the best drivers across the last 10 years. So, here's the plan. 20 drivers. No teams, just the best 20 drivers. And I'm going to try and do them in a bit of an order. But I can tell you now, it's difficult, so I'm going to help you out just a little bit. There's a grid already on the screen, but now I'm going to put some years on there for you. So if you want to pause the video, feel free to do so. You'll be able to have a little guess down in the comment section below, see how many you can get right. But also I'd love to know your top 20 drivers across the decade. Doesn't matter if they've been in one race, if they've been in 10 seasons. All that matters is these are the top 20 drivers across the last 10 years. Enough wasting time, let's jump in to driver number 1. It will come as a surprise to absolutely nobody to see at the very top of my list is the 6-time world champion Lewis Hamilton. 5 of those championships coming across this decade since 2014 alone, the beginning of the hybrid era. Not only has Lewis Hamilton helped his team Mercedes to every single Constructors' World Championship, he's won in every single season, scored points and podiums in every single season, has surpassed every record to be the highest ever pole position sitting driver. He's almost won 50% of the races since the hybrid era. There is no doubt that Lewis Hamilton is at the very top of this list. There's also been some incredible moments. His rivalry with Nico Rosberg was so good during this decade, and even his races at McLaren at the very beginning of the 2010s through to 2012 was so good. A talent that I cannot wait to see how the rest of his career goes. I think this will be his final full decade in Formula One, but definitely Hamilton is at the number 1 spot on my list. I will slot into the number 1 spot, lovely, on the board there. Moving on to number 2, another multiple world champion in this decade. Big surprise who it is, Sebastian Vettel. 2019, definitely not Sebastian's best season in Formula One, but if you just bear with me, 2010 to 2013, 4 championships in a row, was really that team leader at Red Bull. And although 2014 was the only season this decade he didn't pick up a victory, a bit of a blip in his Formula One career, his time at Ferrari for the most part has been very impressive. Has been the team leader. There's been mistakes for sure, but Sebastian, there's no way he wasn't going to be on this list. Was so dominant in the early stages of this decade. That time with Red Bull was so good for them. Perhaps not for the rest of the Formula One family and grid, but definitely number 1 and 2, Hamilton and Vettel. I am very happy with that. From here on out though, it's all a bit of a game. All gets very controversial, is a good way of putting it, but also very opinionated. So again, this is going to completely differ to all of the grids you have done. But number 3, I've put the other world champion from this decade, Nico Rosberg. A driver who definitely gave as good as it got in Formula 1, his time against Michael Schumacher in the early stages, building up the Mercedes team from 2010 through to the time where Schumacher left the team at the end of 2012, was an impressive period for Rosberg, picking up his first ever win in that 2012 season. But that incredible, intense rivalry with Lewis Hamilton, the mind games that went on, and ultimately that World Championship he was able to win, definitely he's got to be on the list. And some of those moments where he was up against Hamilton and it really did reach boiling point brought us some of the most exciting and dramatic moments of the last 10 years. Rosberg, for me, definitely deserves a space on this list. Number 4, another world champion, not so much this decade, but Fernando Alonso. His time, his return to McLaren wasn't great, and that's an understatement for you, but his time at Ferrari was brilliant. The very first race of the decade, his first race for Ferrari, only went and won it in Bahrain, fought for the title right down to the wire in a car which wasn't great. Likewise, in 2012, the car wasn't great, and he was right there to that final weekend in Brazil. And whilst that magical title with Ferrari never quite came, there was a victory in Monza. There were multiple impressive moments on track, but also off track. We had some incredible Fernando moments, and team radio as well. Who could forget some of those with McLaren? An iconic driver. On the list, number 4. Number 5, a big smile coming your way. The honey badger himself, Daniel Ricciardo, king of the late breakers. For me, this decade has been one of the most exciting drivers, not only to watch, but to see his career develop and now flourish into a role at Red Bull. Now he's obviously moved on to Renault, and it's getting a little bit shaky again. But considering 2011, he was at HRT, and if you don't know who HRT are, probably best it stays that way. They weren't very good. Sorry, HRT fans, if you still exist. But moving to Toro Rosso, up against Jean-Eric Vergne, a really good teammate, watching the two of them fight to be at Red Bull, and eventually Ricciardo's promotion to Red Bull, up against Sebastian Vettel, who had just won 4 seasons in a row. Ricciardo wins 3 races that season. Vettel doesn't win any. Vettel's off. Ricciardo instantly, only young, became that team leader. It's only now Max Verstappen is slowly coming into his prime, which that's a scary thought. 22 and coming into his prime. Yeah, don't worry, he's on the list. But Ricciardo, the way he was able to control that team, and when you see the issues Red Bull are having now, getting in another driver, I think really proves how good he is. And even in 2019, he's been one of those stars in the midfield. Some of the best overtakes, one of the best characters the last decade. Number 5, I'm happy with that. Number 6, it's the driver that Ricciardo replaced at Red Bull, Mark Webber. Probably higher than most people have put him on their lists, but if you just let me explain, Webber is a driver who only raced up until 2013, 4 full seasons this decade, but those 4 seasons were pretty good. But not only that, they were pretty spicy, they were pretty fiery with teammate Sebastian Vettel, multi-21, not bad for a number 2 driver, are the 2 big ones that stick out in my mind. Webber, who was a respected driver in the noughties, suddenly became a driver winning races, pole positions, multiple podiums, and had opportunities to fight for the title, was one of the 4 drivers that could have won it at the end of 2010 in that final race of the season, gave it a go in 2012, but never quite was able to get the better of teammate Sebastian Vettel. But that rivalry, similar to Hamilton and Rosberg, it's a bit of an iconic rivalry, so he had to be on the list. And for the entertainment he brought us, definitely high on the list, in my opinion. Behind him, don't worry, it's Max Verstappen. Of course he was going to be on the list, and I am certain if I ever do one of these again for the next decade, I'd probably say Verstappen will be number 1 or 2. I really think the imprint this young man has had on Formula 1 in his short time here has been mega impressive. Up against teammates like Carlos Sainz, Daniel Ricciardo, Gasly, Albon, he's been a more than fair match for them, even beating the majority of them over the course of a season. I think for Verstappen, those first couple of years, or year and a bit, with Carlos Sainz, he had to learn. he had to grow, but very quickly we have seen any kind of mistake instantly. That's been rectified the next weekend. Multiple wins. Now in 2019, he's finally got pole positions. And there was a sniff at one stage in the summer break where people thought maybe he could hunt down Hamilton. A little bit far-fetched in the end, but we can dream. That's, not in Formula One with Mercedes around. But he's been very impressive. And definitely that first race for Red Bull, 2016 Spain, one of the moments of the season. And although that rest of the year didn't quite flourish as perhaps people would have thought, that one race, a very, very special weekend for Max Verstappen, for the whole of Formula One. The youngest ever winner in Formula One, more than deserves his place in the top 10. Arguably, you could have put him in the top 5. Behind Max Verstappen, though, is another world champion, JB. Jenson Button. It seems funny to me that he was driving this decade. Seems such a long time since he was in Formula One, but of course he did leave us at the end of 2016 after a few turbulent years with McLaren, and that's putting it lightly. 2013, partnered Sergio Perez, wasn't a brilliant year whatsoever. No podiums, and of course 2012, McLaren had the best car for several stages of that season. Fought for the world title, likewise in 2010. 2011, Button was only second to Sebastian Vettel. There were plenty of moments during those first 3 years of the decade where Button would have been higher on my list. But it's those times afterwards where Button was the team leader at McLaren and really got the best out of those cars. But perhaps as it got a little bit later on, when Fernando Alonso joined the team, when Honda came on board and everything fell apart, perhaps hurt his legacy just a little bit, but I still think there's multiple victories. Of course, he's the last man to win a race for McLaren and did get a podium, technically, in Melbourne at the beginning of the hybrid era in 2014. P8, I'm happy with that for JB. P9, someone who has brought us plenty of smiles during the last decade and also some brilliant racing. The Iceman himself, Kimi Räikkönen. Of course, he'd retired at the beginning of the decade. That was one of the big stories going into 2010. Räikkönen was gone. I don't think many of us expected him to return in 2012, yet alone still be here in 2019. But Kimi came back and in that first year won a Grand Prix with Lotus in Abu Dhabi. An incredible race, an incredible season actually, that finished in the top 3 overall. The year later, 2013, only went and won the first race of the season. Then there was a little bit of a gap till his next race victory. Well, more than a little bit of a gap. Over 5 years until his next race victory. But what a moment it was. 2018, the US Grand Prix with Ferrari, knowing he only had 4 or 5 more races with Ferrari, and he won it in dramatic style in front of Hamilton, in front of Sebastian Vettel, who had the edge over Kimi Räikkönen once he moved to Ferrari. And that's probably why he's a little bit lower down on my list, because that Ferrari period wasn't as special as it definitely could have been. But top 10, I'm happy with for Kimi Räikkönen. And our final driver within the top 10, he's only been with us a few seasons, and perhaps this is one of the more controversial drivers I have chose on my list, but I've gone with Charles Leclerc, a driver who's only been in Formula One for 2 seasons, but already, a little bit like the Max Verstappen effect, has had such a massive effect on the world of Formula One and the driver market. I can't wait to see what he and Verstappen do over the next 10 years, but already, the way he's been able to go into Ferrari, give him a bit of fresh air, but also that incredible weekend in Monza after what has been one of the most difficult journeys to Formula One I have ever witnessed from any driver. He thoroughly deserved all the success he had in Monza and over the course of the season. For me, what he has been through, what he's been able to achieve already in such a short time in Formula One, 7 pole positions, the most of any driver this year, is not something to be laughed at. The way he was able to jump into the Alfa Romeo car last year and do so well in the midfield, overtakes around the outside of 130R in your first season of Formula One is so ridiculous. Charles Leclerc in the top 10. You might not like it. It's my list. He's in at number 10. I would accept though if you wanted to put this next driver in the top 10, but he just misses out for me, Valtteri Bottas. Now, I've often defended Valtteri. I've often said people don't give him enough credit. And I'm going against my own words in this particular list. But Valtteri at Williams was a special driver. Up against Pastor Maldonado in his first year, then up against Felipe Massa for several seasons, he was the better of those drivers. He really was, and became instrumental in Williams' success over the beginning of the hybrid era. And actually, I think Williams are missing a driver like Valtteri Bottas at the moment, with that bit of experience, that bit of pace, and that willingness to win races. The only difficulty is, since joining Mercedes, we've almost seen, for me anyway, a bit of a different Valtteri Bottas. Someone who I think respects the team, doesn't want to throw away valuable points, but I think that's perhaps has hurt his reputation, whereas he used to be a driver who was daring on the brakes, used to be a little bit on the edge with some of his overtakes. Now he's definitely a lot more conservative, thinks of the team first, which is fantastic for Mercedes, who, with Bottas, has won every single Constructors' Championship once he's been there. Of course, this season has helped the team to a record number of 1-2s in a row since the beginning of the year. And yet, that consistency within Valtteri is all over the place, has been pretty awful since joining Mercedes. There has been wins, there has been pole positions, and on his day could be a match for Lewis Hamilton. But considering he's in a Mercedes, I'd love to see more. I need to see more to put him higher on the list. I need to see him fight for championships. I need to see him give Hamilton a real run for his money. He's not yet done that. P11, I'm happy with. P12 is Valtteri's former teammate Felipe Massa, a driver who, again, didn't make it to the end of the decade, but he did more than his fair share of seasons in Formula 1. And actually, I've put Felipe Massa P12 mainly thanks to what he was able to do at the beginning of the decade during his time with Ferrari, alongside Fernando Alonso. And I definitely think the Massa we saw alongside Alonso at Ferrari wasn't the Massa we saw in the previous decade, but what happened in 2009 definitely, understandably, had some effect on his driving. 100% no fault of Felipe's. But he was the number 2 driver at Ferrari. He was, and there were some very entertaining moments with Lewis Hamilton over the course of 2011 and 2012. No victories this decade, which is what I find quite interesting. His last win was actually in that 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix, which again, another statistic which just sort of blows my mind. I can't believe it's been so long since a massive victory. Yes, there was that pole position in Austria, there were multiple podiums, and there's no doubt that Massa played a big role in helping Williams at the beginning of the hybrid era. Definitely deserves a spot on this list. P12 I think's about right. Yeah, that fits with me. Up next, we've got Sergio Perez, arguably Mr. Consistent in the midfield over the last decade. Of course, made his imprint very early on, 2012, his second year in Formula 1, fighting Alonso in a Sauber for a race victory. Mega impressive. It didn't end there that season. Also fantastic races in Canada, in Monza. Got his chance at McLaren, but was dropped after 1 year. That car wasn't great. Sergio wasn't great. But up against Jenson Button, who had been at the team for several years, a world champion, that was a little bit harsh. However, racing at Force India, now Racing Point ever since, he has been one of the most consistent drivers throughout that time period. Multiple podiums in cars that weren't great, up against drivers definitely of a high calibre. Nico Hülkenberg, Esteban Ocon, Lance Stroll. Yeah, maybe not that last one, but I think has definitely warranted his place on the Formula 1 grid. And if he was to go, I think there would be uproar. A driver who I still think has been super unlucky not to get a chance at a top team. There's been some questionable driving from Sergio. That relationship with Esteban Ocon was fiery, on the edge, but definitely deserves a place on the list. Next up, P14. Another driver, super consistent, Carlos Sainz. Someone who, a few years ago, was slipping under the radar a little bit, but did very well up against Max Verstappen, did very well up against Danny Kvyat, did super well this season at McLaren. Totally warrants a spot just this season alone. 2019, he's my driver of the year. The breath of fresh air himself and Lando Norris have brought to the team has been so good. And of course that podium in Brazil, icing on the cake, easy to put Carlos Sainz on this list. And I think P14 is about right. Behind him, a driver who's been in Formula 1 a little bit longer than Sainz, but that podium eludes him. And sadly, he might not get the opportunity to rectify that. Nico Hülkenberg, of course, that pole position in his first year of Formula 1 at Williams, had a year out in 2011 and has been driving ever since. And a little bit like Perez, has definitely been consistent, fighting at the top of that midfield, and actually has finished with inside the top 10 in every single year since his comeback in 2011. But he wasn't able to do it this year. And up against Ricciardo, Renault have put all their chips into his basket. Ultimately, he's lost his drive. But for me, still one of the top 20 drivers on the grid. Totally deserves a spot on this list. 5 drivers to go. And this is where the fun begins, as a great man once said. P16, please don't shout at me. Please don't shout at me. Romain Grosjean. I know, you don't need to tell me. You don't need to tell me. 2012 wasn't great. 2012, Grosjean did enjoy a crash. He really did. 2018, there were lots of questionable crashes. 2019 was okay. But I think the years in between that was quite respectable. Of course, 10 podiums is a nice statistic to have. And there's lots of drivers on this list that haven't got anywhere near 10 podiums, but that's a very straightforward statistic. That Lotus car he was in wasn't awful in 2012 and 2013. But 2013, considering what he'd been through in 2012, considering at the end of the year he was tasked with the challenge of becoming team leader. Of course, Raikkonen left the team thanks to monetary issues. Kovalainen came in for a few races, and Grosjean was comfortably the better of the two. 2014 and 15, Grosjean was by far the team leader, much better than Pastor Maldonado, ultimately leading to that insane podium at the Belgian Grand Prix in 2015. The team showed up to that weekend with the bailiffs. They had no money, it was unsure whether they were going to race, and with 2 laps to go, Sebastian Vettel's tyre exploding, podium for Lotus. What an incredible weekend that was. And of course, the birth of Haas F1, Grosjean was the team leader. He was the figurehead for 2 seasons straight. Was instrumental in bringing them up to the top 5 fight for 2018. It's just a shame that when it actually came, he was the one letting the team down in 2018. And of course, 2019 was okay. The car was pretty awful. And I feel that's hurting his reputation now. And he's got a big task on his hands to save his career next season. But definitely for me, a driver who has proven he can get podiums. 2013, Japan sticks out in my mind, fighting the 2 Red Bull cars for a race victory. And for so long was leading that Grand Prix. Deserves a spot, for sure. Leave me alone. Grosjean P16. P17, someone who also has had a pretty turbulent time in Formula 1. Danny Kvyat, of course, he made his comeback this year, and I think without that comeback, I probably wouldn't have put him on the list. But he has been so good this year in 2019, perhaps not in the second half, but in the first half, considering all he had been through with the Red Bull family, to get that podium in Germany, but not only that, to score multiple points finishes, and even his time before he was kicked out of the Red Bull team, finishing in front of Ricciardo in 2015 over an entire season, deserves some merit. So P17, it's short and sweet, my little speech on Danny Kvyat, but for me, he has been one of the top 20 drivers over the last decade. P18. Now, I feel a little bit sorry for this driver because I think he deserves to be higher on the list. His achievements outside of Formula 1 definitely warrant it. It's just a shame he didn't really get a big opportunity in Formula 1, and that's Jean-Eric Vergne. And there's not really a lot to say. 2011 to 2014 was in that Red Bull family, obviously got that full-time drive in 2012, but never really got an opportunity to shine after that. He was up against Daniel Ricciardo for 2 years and they were so equally matched, and it was almost a flip of the coin which of them would get that move to Red Bull. He was better than Kvyat for that extra season, but understandably didn't want to stay at Red Bull for another year. The team were bringing in Verstappen and Sainz for the next season. There was nowhere to go for Verne, and I really think he's one of those drivers that I see over this decade as slipping through the cracks and could have been a very, very solid driver in Formula 1. Of course, he's doing very well in Formula E, and fair play to him, but I just feel Formula 1 have missed out on quite a special talent there in Jean-Eric Verne. 2 drivers to go, and P19, I've got someone who, you've probably guessed who this is by looking at the years they raced in Formula 1, but someone who brought so much to the sport, but in this decade, didn't get a victory, got 1 podium and 1 incredible pole position which was taken away from him, but Michael Schumacher, what he was able to do with Mercedes and what he was able to turn them into for the hybrid era is an incredible achievement. And we have to forget what happened with Ferrari because that's not this decade and that's not what we're talking about, but the achievements he was able to do. The comeback perhaps wasn't a bigger fairy tale as probably people would have liked, but I think that podium in Valencia put a smile on a lot of people's faces. Definitely proved he still had the speed, had the consistency, not what he once was, but I still think Michael Schumacher, the legacy he has left on Formula 1, some people say he was hurt by his return, but I definitely think he was instrumental in building Mercedes to what they are today. So Schumacher makes it onto the list. And finally, number 20. There's lots of drivers that have missed out. Paul di Resta, Adrian Sutil, Robert Kubica, Jarno Trulli, Kovalainen. But P20, this is an interesting one. I've gone with Pastor Maldonado, a driver who wasn't great for the majority of the decade, but 2012 alone, that 1 win alone is one of the moments of the decade. It really is, considering where Williams were, considering that this is a driver, Maldonado, who loved to crash. More than Grosjean, Maldonado loved to crash, but what he was able to do that weekend, to take on Alonso in his own backyard. Williams, who had been nowhere for the previous 4 or 5 seasons, were at the back of the grid for the majority of those years. What an incredible weekend. And for that weekend alone, for that race victory alone, gets on my list. And that's your lot for the top 20 drivers of the decade. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you agree with some of my list, but I'd rather you didn't, and I'd rather we have a nice juicy debate down in the comment section. So if you're new around here, feel free to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.